Hi, guys. So, a lot of artistic maps seek to imitate historic ones, and that's usually the yellow-edged copper plate engraved variety. But my eye is more often drawn to maps made in the 20th century. This would be maps from after a time when our more modern ideas about graphic design had developed, but before cartography went digital. And I won't pretend to be an expert in this part of cartographic history, but I do find that many of the maps that I'm drawn to from this era were made with what I'm calling tough design, meaning they were resilient. These are maps that were designed with the knowledge they'd be printed on cheap paper with cheap ink, and probably with only one color plate. And that meant that fine lines, delicate patterns, subtle hues, and gradient tones, these were all out of the question. Of course, that kind of restriction is still in play for a lot of maps today. We saw a few cool examples of that yesterday. But since our default maps start with all of the visual bells and whistles, it can actually be extra work to pare things down to something simpler. This particular map I'm showing here was published by the Auto Club. There was no further attribution provided. But in 1976 is reproduced in this local history book. I have a copy here if you want to check it out. And I'm not sure what paper the original map was printed on, but it was later photographed and reprinted in this book. Then I took a photo of it with my phone, and I upped the contrast a bit, and now I'm showing it to you on this projector. So that's a lot of media changes, and every time the media has changed, you can expect some degree of quality degradation. So I'm calling this map tough because it passes the photocopy test. After all of that reproduction and changing media, it's still legible, it's still beautiful. So today, those physical limitations of color plates and paper texture, they often don't apply. But maybe you really like the look of these maps, the graphic design style, and you want to copy it for your own. If so, I think that it's a really good idea to understand where those design decisions originally came from before you start doing it yourself. I'm losing my mouse here. Anyway, if you're going to do that, you're going to have to gather your own data because the ready-made base maps aren't really going to cut it. So the workflow I'm showing you was all done in ArcGIS Pro, and in Pro you get a whole bunch of really great base maps, but these are mainly designed to be viewed on screens, not on newsprint. Lucky for you, you can use the ArcGIS Vector Tile Style Editor to build your own base map style without having to collect any data. So I challenge you all to go make some really cool photocopy-proof base maps. Less lucky for me, that product was still in development when I started making this map. So I had to go out there and find all my data, and I won't talk about that because I think you all know how that process goes. And you probably also all know how the process goes for thinning and generalizing your data. It's tedious, it's time consuming, going from this to this. But I think that process, this is actually the truest heart of cartography. It's a lot of work. It can be automated, but that doesn't make it any less of an art. But thinning your data, this is the part of the process where you're really forced to look at your data, look at it up close, and ask questions, which is something you're not going to be doing if you're using a ready-made base map. For example, that line in the north there, is there actually a road there? Why does part of this shape qualify as a dry lake and part of it doesn't? Is my data out of date? Although I didn't use a ready-made base map in this map, I used a lot of them for reference material. So I recommend keeping a whole stack of them in your contents pane and using the swipe tool going back and forth. It's really handy to compare different data sources and do data checking if you can't actually physically go to a place. Of course, all that data checking is the slippery slope that can consume literally all of your time, and you're going to have to make the call for yourself when enough accuracy and generalization is enough for the purposes of your map, your audience, and your sanity. Making a reference map is extremely time consuming, but if your purpose is to explore and discover and to understand a place better, which really was the purpose of this map for me, then I think it's really time well spent. So on to symbology. If your map is going to pass the photocopy test, I think it should meet the following criteria, and you may know some more. No lines, symbols, or fonts thinner than 1 point. No gradients, so unfortunately hillshades are out. I used hatchers instead. No subtle textures, you're going to stick to hatches and dots and other symbol patterns. And no color, or only a few bold colors. So I have black for base data and red for thematic data. And a tip, you want to set a reference scale if you are going to print. This can be found in Map Property Dialog for ArcGIS Pro. And this is how you'll make sure that 1 point on your map, if you're sticking to that rule of nothing smaller than 1 point, will actually be 1 point when you print. So whenever you're not sure how to accomplish your map's goals while staying within the confines of that photocopy test, you can refer to the map that inspired you and see how it handled the same limitations. Copy what you like, ignore what you don't like. For example, I really liked how this map depicted towns as little nodes along the road and railroad network. And this map also used hatchers. I don't really think hatcher is the best way to depict terrain, but I felt like I had to try them out. And last year I gave a talk about how to do hand-drawn terrain, scan it, and add it back into your map in ArcGIS Pro. So if you missed that, you can read the blog at this link. And I use the same process for this map. So this is another map from the same book, and I'm showing it because it looks like it was made with a photocopier and some pretty cool labels. I think that the photocopier is a particularly charming medium, and I wanted to capture just a little bit of that imperfect charm in my map. Right now, my map looks, in my opinion, just a little bit too polished and crisp and clean. So next I'm going to show you just a small trick for making your map look a little bit more last century. So when you've completely finished your map, you can export the layout. You can find that button on the Share tab of the ribbon in Pro. And save it as a JPEG at 150 dpi. The default is 300, so you are intentionally downgrading the quality of your map at this point. Then I open it in Photoshop, and you can see that quality is not great. I think you can see it from the back there. There's a lot of pixelation. So next I upsampled the image, changed the resolution to 300. And you'll probably find that there's still a lot of gray artifacts hanging around from the downgrade, and you can just clean those up with the levels editor. So what you're left with after that is that you find that the fonts and symbols, they're all a little bit wobbly, a little less crisp, less uniform. They no longer look brand new, but they don't have that ugliness of pixelation. Of course, in 50 years, pixelation will probably look cool and retro, but not yet. For reference, that's what it looked like before. That's what it looked like after. And you can make it more dramatic if you export from Pro at an even lower DPI. This is what happened when I tried at 100, but some of the labels fell apart at that point, so I stuck with my first attempt. So this hack, I think, is not unlike the time-honored tradition of staining your paper with tea to make it look like an ancient treasure map. It's just for a different era. And of course, if you actually print this on cheap paper, or I suspect show it on a projector, a subtle trick like this is not going to survive. It's imitating tough maps, but it in itself is not tough. I will admit that my intent with this map was not actually to create something to pass the photocopy test. It was because I wanted to map the mining history of the Mojave Desert. But in doing so, I was asking a lot of questions about why was this map made this way? Why did they choose these symbols over those symbols? And I came to these conclusions about tough cartographic design. So if I want to leave you with anything, it's not about wobbly text. My parting thought is more about how do we tackle the task of design imitation. You see a map from the past that's really cool, you want to imitate it, you go, you copy the fonts, you copy the colors, that's great. But if you want to, I think if you want to imitate the true spirit of that map. You'll have more success if you know something more about how and why that map was made that way in the first place. Thanks very much. You can read a tutorial blog that is similar to this talk about this map at that URL. Thank you.